because we got a lot of slides and a lot to cover, so it's kind of a big topic. So anyway, my name's Jim Smith, and I'm a Drupal developer at Oak Ridge National Laboratory.
And my name is Brownlee. I'm the same. Jim and I actually work with each other and sit right across from each other.
Yeah, side by side in cubicles. So as I said, Oak Ridge National Laboratory, that's in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, just up the road here, about 3 hours. And about 3 or 4 months ago, well, maybe it's a little bit more than that now, we had begun a project to migrate ORNL.gov from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. Now, if you happen to go to it right now, you'll see still the Drupal 7 site, because the project is not entirely done. We're still in the process of final steps towards publishing the new version here soon. Originally, another member of our team was assigned to handle the migration part of this task, and she then took a new job, and at the very last moment before she left, she said, "Here, Jim, you're supposed to do the migration now, so here's all that I know." And I as I like to tell Derek, I'm a liberal arts major. I didn't study computer science, so stuff like databases and that kind of stuff is something that I'm kind of just a little bit beyond my comfort level, but it all worked fine, except for what we're going to talk about, which is some of the things that we came across. So I guess that's why you.
So what we are going to cover in this session is the basics of a migration from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, the mistakes that we made, because it's always helpful to learn from your mistakes, right? And helpful tips and tricks that we discovered along the way while we were making all those mistakes. What we're not covering, migrating from other CMSs, other data sources. We're just kind of sticking to what we've done here in D7. Solutions for every migration problem, because you're going to run into a lot.
But what we did want to talk about was how to make your migration complete, how to make it easy, and how to make it reproducible. Actually, that's not quite true, because what we're going to tell you is that you probably aren't going to want to make it complete, and also that it probably isn't going to be easy. That's just kind of the facts of this. And I learned this pretty quickly as I was beginning this task, in that I had watched all the videos, read all the blog posts about migration, and it all looked pretty easy, and I thought, oh, I've got this. I understand how it works. What we discovered was our website provided a lot of complexity. I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads, and so I guess some of you have been in the same boat. And so what we hope to do is kind of get you beyond. That's why we called it the missing manual here, is that even though there are lots of blog posts, and even though there are lots of information on the web, they generally cover it at a sort of a superficial level. And well, maybe that's not fair. They cover it in a way that assumes that you have a very basic website that you're migrating, and ours was far from basic.
So, like Jim said, we were not the originators of this migration project. Jim inherited it, and then I got brought on to help out. And one of the biggest mistakes we realized is we didn't plan as much as we could have. Plan until you're sick of planning and your manager is asking, why have you not started this yet? Because you need a plan. You need a detailed plan of what all is involved in this process? Well, what all is involved with this process? Your content. Does it all need to go? Can you leave some of it behind? Can we rethink what our content is and where it's going to go? We're making a big jump from D7 to D8. There's a lot of structural stuff that changes. Are we going to restructure how that content lives in the new site? We've got a plan for that move. What can we do to make everything nicer and easier? How can we clean this up along the way? You don't want to bring the skeletons out of the closet with you when you make this progress, right? We want to make things nicer and easier for us as developers, but also for the content editors. So what can we clean up along the way? And what can we make better and easier for the people who are going to be looking to us saying, you've made this change, why is this not easier? Why is this not better?
So as Derek mentioned right at the when he was going down that list, was that there are some things that you may not want to migrate at all. And what we found, one of the things that we found was that in our old site, there were 45 content types. And I'm not exaggerating, there, because I counted. The thing of it was is there were several that were never used for content. And you might ask, well, how does that happen? Well, we have a team of people that are, and sometimes you want to coordinate everything, and sometimes you have an idea of something, and so you start building with this idea in mind, and then plans change and you divert. And a lot of that actually happened years ago when the site was initially constructed, and there was a migration from a proprietary content management system into Drupal. And so there were decisions that were changed along the way as to how to do it. I think there was some budgetary issues and some other questions, and so those things happen, and we've probably all have experienced those kinds of things. Well, so what don't you want to migrate? Well, in our case, one of the things was configuration, because we wanted to start with a clean slate on the back end with new content types, and so there wasn't any point in doing a wholesale configuration change. Another thing that we changed was that we had a lot of vocabularies that we wanted to combine into one. And so it didn't make sense to migrate all of that as once. We just created on our working copy of our new site the infrastructure for content types and vocabularies and such, and then just migrated the content to those. The other thing you don't want to migrate is content that nobody sees. And every site has this obscure page that you thought was important at one time, but it's no longer important. And so you want to look at your web traffic and really kind of consider, does anybody care about this page? Or did somebody care about it at one time and no longer cares about it? So don't migrate stuff that you don't need anymore. And then sometimes migration involves a lot of work, a lot of testing, and maybe there's content that, there's that one content type where there's maybe 5 nodes. Maybe it's easier just to copy and paste that. And the copy-paste approach doesn't work if you are doing a migration over time and people in the meantime are updating content. But if that doesn't happen, then just copy and paste it. As long as, obviously, you're not going to do that for hundreds of nodes, but if you only have a small handful, do that.
So here's a mock-up of what the new site will look like. And as we're going through this process, we have to remember this is the end goal. Like, this is what we are expected to produce. How are we going to get there? This is part of that planning, right? What is on that page that I'm responsible for from a migration standpoint? Where is that going to come from? So here's 6 items that I have to identify the source for that content. This is coming from a directorate page that currently exists in the D7 site. Where am I going to get each piece of that content, and how is it going to be created? Are we looking at fields? Are we looking at entities? Are we looking at the need to develop some paragraph types? Like, we've got to make these decisions and understand what our process is before we even think about writing code, or else you're going to be up here giving your own talk about the mistakes that you made during your migration.
So the other thing you want to plan is how, in what order you're going to do your migration, and that is important. It's probably going to be obvious once you start getting into it, but you want to make sure that you understand what that order is. And so this is an example, and this is probably pretty close to what most migrations are going to do. If you are going to migrate configuration, you have to do that first because your content will have to go into the content types and what have you. As I said, we chose not to do that. Second would be taxonomy terms, and again, we chose not to migrate our taxonomy terms because we were restructuring how we wanted to do that. But then the next thing would be users, and the reason why that's next is because a lot of your content has to reference users. Then files, and then media entities we're taking advantage of the new media module and the infrastructure that goes with that. So we are migrating the files, but then creating a new migration of those files into entities. And then paragraphs, which then get attached to nodes. So in a lot of cases, those media entities get attached to paragraphs. And then, so you have to do that in a logical order.
So we've done our planning. Now we're ready to think about the migration and what that entails. A migration is really just getting a source into a destination. Your source, we talked about, our experience here is with Drupal 7, but your source can be all kinds of different other CMSs, any kind of file that contains your data, right? And our goal is to get that into our brand new shiny Drupal 8 site. Well,
so the magic part is where things get complicated. But what it really is a series of processes. And these are done through through plugins that in many cases Drupal core provides, or Drupal contrib modules provide, and in some cases perhaps you're going to write a plugin of your own. But what you're doing is you're stacking these processes together to manipulate the content so that it can go from the source to the destination in the format that you want to wind up in.
So how are we going to get there? Well, there's core modules. Migrate provides the migration API. Migrate Drupal provides the capabilities needed to migrate configuration and content. The Migrate Drupal UI gives you the pages you can go to actually see this visually and to actually execute some of these migrations if you want to do it through the interface. Some additional modules. Migrate Upgrade provides Drush support, Drush commands to do these migrations. Migrate Tools, again, is Drush support, view status, and perform operations. Migrate Plus is another module, gives you additional things like creating groups for your migrations, provides you with additional process plugins, and one that was useful for us, Migrate Source CSV, allows you to use a CSV file as your source, so that can be another source process for migrating and creating your content, getting it into the database. And
that last module, by the way, there is an issue right now to move that into core, so which makes sense because a lot of migration can come from CSV.
A few more modules. Migrate Devel, we'll get back on this one in a minute, because if you take nothing else away from this, Migrate Devel can help you so much if you're involved in these migrations on your own. It provides debug information of what's actually happening during your migration steps as it's occurring right there in front of you on the command line. Migrate manifest provides template-based migrations using a manifest format. It's a split off from Migrate Plus. We didn't use it for this migration. It's just good to know out there there's different ways that you can approach this. It's Drupal, right? Which way is the right way to do it? The way that you got it done. Migrate Run is another one. It's a fork of Migrate Tools. Has no dependencies on Migrate Plus. It's for command line folks. It's just very simple. Everything is in the command line to give you tools to run these migrations.
So every migration involves YAML files, and that's much like, in fact, they're exactly like the configuration files that you're familiar with if you've been working with the configuration system within Drupal 8. So the migration YAML files are broken down into the same steps that we just talked about, the source, the process, and the destination. But there's also a section for metadata which provides some information that Drupal can kind of display or store about the actual migration files. There's only one part of that that's required, and that is the ID. But the other information is helpful if you're going to check out what your migration status is through the UI, assuming you've turned on the Migrate UI module.
So like Jim said, there's 3 steps to this. First step is your source. Where is your data going to come from? There are source plugins that will fetch the data from whatever your source is and provide that to you for you to then move on down the chain. The source can be any kind of structured data. It can be a database, CSV, JSON, anything that you want to deal with, any way that you can get your content into a form that we can then start to process it. Plugins, these source plugins come from core, from these contrib modules we mentioned a second ago, or custom modules. Very helpful to get familiar with these plugins. They're listed all over the place. You can search for Migrate plugin as a string to find ones that are available to you. But becoming familiar with what those plugins are and what they do for you is a good step in the planning and understanding what you're going to do.
And you don't want to write a custom plugin if what you need to do already exists in a contrib or core module.
So the source part in your migration definition, here's an example where our plugin we're using is D7 node, and the node type, capability ORNL, that's a content type in our source database that we're going to be dealing with in this particular migration.
And that particular one is a core plugin. So the process is also a part of your YAML file, and as I said earlier, you can stack these in a series of things. You're going to do things like copy data straight over, or maybe add some default data. You can combine or extract parts that you want or don't want. You can just skip the certain pieces of the data altogether. You can take some data from one part of your content type and move it to a different field altogether. You can manipulate it. All these things can be done within plugins. And then, as I said, these can be chained together so that you can, say, extract some data, combine it with some other data, and then pipe it out to your destination. So this is what a YAML file, the section of the YAML file looks like for the process. In this case, we're chaining a migration lookup, which is, as I said earlier, where you have to run some migrations first before you can run other. In here, we've already migrated some files, and now we're going to convert that into a media entity. So you see that the destination field name is MID or media ID, and then so the lookup will find the field ID in the previous migration, and then if in this particular case the next plugin is skip on empty, which is saying if that doesn't exist, then we're using method row, which says then don't do anything more to the migration, just stop. There's another method which is called process, which allows the migration to continue and just ignores this part of the migration.
And the last step is destination, putting your content into your new site. Destination plugins, your point there is you're defining what is being created in Drupal 8 by this process. Now those can be various entities, nodes, users, taxonomy terms, files, media entities. There are destination plugins and definitions for all of these. But as we talked about before, we didn't deal with migrating configuration, but you can do that. You can do set up migrations that will create content types for you. And configuration entities, that's something that can be a destination as well. That part of a typical file, here we're defining the plugin that we're using as entity media, so we're creating a media item out of here. And we've got some dependencies for previous migrations listed there.
So when you're migrating from another website that has a database, you can connect directly to it using the standard information that you provide, settings.php, that you would do if you were connecting to your regular database. In this particular case, you see that the database has been labeled legacy, and then in your YAML files in which you are creating to structure your migration, you'll make sure that the legacy is identified there so that the migration knows which database to connect to get that source data. But otherwise, you're connecting to the database just as you would the site that you're creating. We mentioned earlier that other sources can be used besides a database, and one of those is CSV, and that's a pretty common way to go. And we found that in some cases that it is a very easy way to go. For one thing, the nice thing about CSV is especially if you load it into Excel or something like that, you can see it all at once, all of your data, and you can scroll down and whatever to look at all the different fields. And this also gives you a chance to very quickly clean up the data before you begin the migration. If you want to do like a copy, find and replace to change a word that was misspelled frequently on your site, or change some. You can do this in your process plugins as well, but the point being is sometimes by seeing it all at once, you can catch some of these mistakes and fix them. So that's why using a CSV is a convenient way to go. It doesn't always work great, but it's handy. And Derek ended up having to do this in one case, but what he did was he created a custom query using SQL Pro, right? And then use that to convert this custom query into a spreadsheet. That way you don't have to rely on these multiple migrations or whatever if you're trying to combine different data sources.
And that is a really good example of a mistake that I made that is something to learn from. Is in this particular case, we had the content type with over 6,000 nodes, and I could not get the data to be pulled out of the database. It wouldn't work. It wouldn't give me everything. It would fail, junk. I spent way too much time trying to figure out how to make this work by pulling it from the database, when I had the capability right in front of me to create a query, I could create a view, anything you wanted to get that data and spit it out into a CSV. That allowed me to do a little bit of processing on the side to clean up some content stuff and then process it via CSV. Got rid of all that overhead of dealing with connecting to the database. Never had any other problems running the migration again. So, you know, there's other ways to do it, right? If you run into roadblocks, don't keep banging your head against this one thing. Think about if there's a different way to approach your source. And like we've been talking about, these migration configuration files, they're config. So how do we get them into the Drupal site? Well, we can use configuration management to just take our configuration definition or migration definition file, paste it in, do a single item import. Now the database knows about our migration. We could go through the GUI to run it and execute it if we wanted to go that approach for a very simple migration. But if you're going to do a large migration, you're likely going to want to do it through a module. Why would you want to do that? Well, you got a live site that you're migrating from. The source is going to change. You're going to need to want to do this multiple times. You're not going to be wanting to do that cut and paste migration stuff, right? We want to have this all into a single item that we can deal with like we would any other module. Custom plugins. We talked briefly about process. We're going to get into some more process stuff in a minute. If you need to do some custom processing of your data through plugins that don't exist or not given to you, you're going to want to capture those in a module. And if you use a source other than a database, like in our case where we're combining, the majority of our items are coming from a database connection. We've got this one large item that's coming from a CSV. All right, we want to wrap all that up, package it up in a nice module that is our migration. The thing about a module, and this bit us more times than I could count, this is configuration, right? So the database has got to know about it. How does the database know about it? How does the database know when things have changed? Well, you've got to re-import the config into the database. So what we each did, more times than we'd like to admit, is make a change to the migration file, run it again. Why didn't that change happen? Well, you've got to disable the module, remove that config, enable the module, import the new config. Now everything knows about your changes.
That was a process that we could have maybe sped up by using the single file import, and just because every time you import it, it doesn't care about where that module is because it's doing it as a single file. But we really try to keep everything within the module because the module gave us some other things like kept everything within code, within Git, and so we are able to keep all the best practices of managing that code.
Another point about the module is once your migration is complete, your module is no longer needed, right? Your migrations, they've done their job. So if everything is wrapped up in a module, it's really simple to go in, uninstall that module, remove that code from your repo, and now we've removed that, thrown it off in the dustbin. It's done, nice and clean.
So Drush gives us several commands that are well, as long as we're using the modules that we spoke of earlier to use Drush, and even though you can run these if you install the Migrate UI module, we found that the Drush method of running the migration was a lot faster for us. And it also gave us some advantages in terms of seeing some feedback that the UI did not give us. So these are the 4 basic commands that are available. The status is just lets you know how many nodes or how many entities are ready to be migrated or have already been migrated. And it gives you an understanding of where things are at that moment. Import would be running the actual migration. Rollback would be if you ran the migration and decided you needed to undo it for whatever reason. And reset is only needed when sometimes the migration will get stuck on it thinks it's still running, and you need to reset it to what's called an idle position so that you can rerun things. And so that's really just kind of a bailout for that. as I said, you could add other information for feedback, and so I don't show that, but that's a flag that you can use that will let you see individually how the migration is going. Or you can use a flag called ID list, and you can add one or more IDs to, so like if you're running a node migration, those will be node IDs, and you can run just a migration of one or two or however many, as long as you want to list these individually. Or if you want to run a small batch, like the first 10, then use a flag of limit. And these are ways to quickly test and see where you are in your development of your YAML files.
So if you're running your migration, let's say you're migrating a node content type, you run it, you do a limit of 10, like Jim's example there. Well, how are you going to test that it's worked? Well, you would go to your Drupal 8 site, you go to the content page, you look for this item, and you go view it. Well, that takes time. Don't worry about that. Use the database. Look at the database. Use something like here we're using SQL Pro, connect to your database locally, look through the tables, look at the content, see what's being entered in, and make sure that you're seeing what you expect. Here is, file table. We're migrating files. We can look and see there's the file name, there's the URL to the file. Things are looking like they're supposed to, right? Come up with quick ways to verify that what you're doing is working. Don't worry about going through the full UI of Drupal to verify what's happening.
As you start to get into this, you'll know what to expect to see, and you'll start seeing things that doesn't look like I expected. But if you're not sure what to expect, then one trick that I found was just create a node and then go to the database and look to see what the database gave you, and then you'll know what else maybe you're missing when you're running a migration.
So every migration that runs creates two tables. The migration that's mapping of itself, of our source to our destination, and then a messages table. So as these migrations happen, if anything bubbles up a message, that'll get stored here. And again, this is a good way to verify what's happening, what worked, what didn't work. You can define messages, message values in your migration files to get stored here, so we can get a better idea of what's happening. And this is super helpful because a lot of times you'll run a migration command and it just, okay, it's done. But things actually happen. They're not being reported back to you on the command line. So this is where you go to find out, what is it complaining about? Did it actually work properly?
So we mentioned earlier about using the ID list as a way to run a migration of a single item, and this demonstrates how you can use the database to pick out what maybe is an ideal node to run, to test on, rather than trying to test on a whole bunch of stuff. Pick out a node that you know is going to be trouble, or one that's a pretty standard. Most of the nodes are going to look like this one, and if you go to your database, if you know what you're looking for in terms of those fields or whatever, you can find that node that does what you want to check, and then just use that ID list equals to run that migration on that one node.
Okay, Migrate Devel module. I mentioned this earlier. This is your new best friend. If you've got to do migrations, Migrate Devel is your new best friend. And we were surprised at how little this came up in our searches to find examples, tutorials, and help. This is so helpful because what it does, it gives you a flag on your drush command, migrate debug, and when it runs your migration, it outputs to the command line two separate lists of data. This is your source. So in our previous example, we were using the D7 node plugin. So it's going to show us, this is everything that I just got from the database for your D7 node. And it gives you your destination. So after we've done all of our processing, this is what it's going to store in the database based on your processing. That helps you so much for that immediate feedback, because like Jim said, eventually you're going to start figuring out what you're expecting to see. And so if you encounter something like this, that's a problem, right? Well, maybe it is, maybe it's not. It all depends on what you're expecting to see. But Migrate Devel is a great way to see that immediately and help you understand what's actually happening in your process steps.
Because if you think about it, Drupal is really two things. It's a database, but then it's using PHP to manage things in an array, or a bunch of arrays. I mean, it's an array nightmare sometimes, we know, but if we're not looking at what the array is, we may not see the problem. The database doesn't tell us everything. So hopefully we've already given you quite a few tips that maybe weren't available when you did what we did, which was go through all the blogs and all the YouTube videos that have been posted. But we've got a few more tips that we want to kind of run through. One is, and this is what I call let Drupal be Drupal. Drupal has some tools that just built into it, and one of those is CK Editor. And so if you don't necessarily have to spend a lot of time cleaning up HTML markup. If you're going to be using CK Editor, you can configure your CK Editor to clean up markup on its own by excluding some markup or what have you. And I had another migration project that this really became helpful to me, and it was a kind of a weird project in which what I was migrating was flat HTML. And this flat HTML had been created over many years using Word, WordPerfect, and various versions of those. So there was no consistency whatsoever to the data, and there was no way to parse it out without spending a ton of time. And the client didn't really care about parsing it out. They just wanted it in Drupal. So what I did was I did a migration in which it was pulling the files in to a body field. And I did a little bit cleanup in a couple of things that I could, just to make sure that there was a little bit of consistency. But then I just had the CK Editor do the rest of the cleanup, which that's what it's intended to do.
So as you're writing these migration definitions, they're going to stack. You're going to have dependencies. You're going to have an order to how these need to be executed. And an important point is understanding the difference when you define those migration dependencies. There's a difference between required and optional. And this has a lot to do with your content, but required can get you into trouble, especially if you're dealing with a live site where content is changing. It's going to require you to go back a couple of levels and rerun those previous migrations. Actually, it's not in that one. In the previous image, we showed one of our migrations. It's called ORNL D7 files. That is a migration of 13,500 so files. You don't want to run that more often than you have to. So we really need to think about, is this required? Is this optional? Is it okay if it's not completely up to date with files that happened in the last couple of days? Or are we all right that we know that we've run it recently?
Another thing that you can do to help manage your development process is write yourself comments in the YAML file, just like you would if you were writing a module or writing a theme where you're providing comments so that the next developer who comes along will know what you've done. In this case, a lot of times you're just writing a note to yourself. But because so much of migration is done iteratively, where you're only working on a part of it and then testing it, and then if that works, then you go on. Obviously, if you try to write one big YAML file and then run it and it doesn't work, you're going to have a hard time figuring out what was it that broke. If one way that I would sometimes do is I would have several fields and I would comment out everything except for one or two fields and then run it and see how if things were going fine, then I would uncomment a next section and run it again. So using comments just like you would in module development is really helpful.
So another thing that you can do is to make it easier on yourself is to parse these steps out by using pseudo-fields. So here we're creating this science areas pseudo-field. This doesn't map to a field in our destination. This is just a temp variable that we're putting together. And the beauty of this and why it's so helpful is we can take these 3 steps, we can combine them, we can run this, we throw in our Migrate debug flag thanks to Migrate Devel, and we're going to see that output right in front of us. So we can know, okay, those 3 steps are working fine. Maybe it's the 4th step that's causing our problem that we left out here. And here is where we're using that pseudo field. We can reference these as a source for our next step. So what we found ourselves doing a lot was creating about 4 different pseudo fields. So we could look at each step and make sure the processing that we thought we needed to happen was actually happening along the way.
We also created dummy variables, and sometimes these were used just to work around some issues that we had. For one thing, we found that skip on empty, a plugin that's used commonly, has some issues when the data is in an array. So what we needed to do was we needed to, as you see, we were trying to combine a lot of sources into one, and then we flattened that array by using the flatten plugin. But then we also threw in this dummy variables just to cover cases where there were no variables that wound up in our array through those, if all those were empty. We found that this was the only solution that we had, was to create this dummy variable that later we could then skip on it on that value, because we didn't have a way of skip on empty. It just, I don't know, it's just a kind of a weakness of skip on empty.
And it gets back to knowing your source content also. In our case, these particular fields, they're not required. They could exist for some nodes, they could not exist for others. So that's got to be part of your planning and processing is what do I do when this does exist? What do I do when it doesn't exist?
We also we're developing for ultimately having our site hosted on Pantheon, and eventually when you're doing a lot of testing locally, but eventually you're going to run these same migrations on your production server, or you're going to run it on a development server and then migrate that first time up to production. But at some point, you're going to want to do have the Pantheon server or wherever you're hosting is going to run these migrations. We found that Pantheon would time out everything after 10 minutes. And if you had a really big, complex, lots of nodes or lots of entities, it would take more than 10 minutes to run some of these things, and they were timing out. And we experimented with some various ways in which maybe we could do it, like chunking it out into, remember I said you could do a limit equals and then have a number that was to chunk out the migration into, say, 100 nodes, for example. And that was fine, but you'd have to babysit that every time. And then just by happenstance, I added feedback as a flag, and for some reason, it overcame that timeout, and it would run continuously for as long as it needed to run the migration. I don't know why the timeout.
It essentially, it acts like it's running each node migration as an individual item, as an individual thread. So you don't have to worry about this timeout. And so when you've got that 13,500, file migration, you can run it and walk away and know that it's going to complete. So we use Lando for our local development. And as we said, this is an iterative process. And we quickly found out that you're looking at about 15 minutes minimum between, okay, I tried this, it didn't work, I've made a change, now I've got to disable the module, re-enable the module, and run this migration again. Turns out, if you disconnect your connection to the outside world, all those delays go away. So what I did, or one we did, is you can go in, if you're running Mac OS, you go in networking, set up an airplane mode location, and turn off your network devices. You can really quickly switch locations from the Apple menu there. So I've got to run this migration, I'm going to pop into airplane mode, and I'm going to run it. And I mean, this like literally blew my mind when I realized that this worked, because we would sit there and just run out of things to chit chat about while you're waiting for this.
Facebook page, all this stuff.
Because it's literally 15 minutes or more to wait for this process to happen. And I don't know why, I haven't investigated it yet. I was just so happy to find out the solution. You can take this another step. There's an app called TripMode, which is really nice. It's great for being on the go. The idea behind TripMode is when you tether your phone to your laptop, TripMode enables, and it blocks everything, and you kind of manually go in and bless certain apps to have network access. What I've done with it is I've gone in and created a profile called Migrations, where I enable everything except for Docker, so that Docker can't touch the network, and I can still, live my internet connected life while I'm running these migrations. It's amazing how much time we've saved just in the past couple weeks.
It's a weird solution, but it works.
Yep.
So we talked a little bit about custom plugins, and at first I thought I would never have to write a custom plugin, and I was glad for that. As I said, I'm not a computer science major, so but over the years that I've been doing Drupal, I've become comfortable in writing modules, and so it's not that big a deal for me. But I was, I've always from the beginning kind of taken the approach: if you don't have to write something custom, you're better off. But there are times when there's no way around it, and it turns out that writing a custom plugin is not very difficult in most cases. This is an example of a custom plugin that is solving one very specific problem, in which we had to do some stuff in the array that where we were combining a bunch of arrays, and we ended up with some duplicate term IDs. And so we wanted to get rid of those term IDs, and so there is a contrib module, or well, actually, I think it may be is it a contrib or a core plugin that does that lets you run some PHP commands.
Oh,
callback, yeah. I don't know, contrib or core. There is a callback plugin, but the limitation of that is that it will run PHP functions that don't require
anything but the input options.
Yeah. So if you've got some arguments that are required in that particular function, the callback plugin will not work. So so that wasn't the case here, where we wanted to chain a couple of these standard PHP functions and make it into one plugin. And this was another one in which we had a content type that did not have a date field, but we were migrating content into a content type where the date was required. And so, but I did have the created date that I could work with. Because the date conversion requires some arguments, I created a very simple plugin to handle that, and that just gets added into the YAML file just like you would any other plugin, and it turned out to be pretty easy.
So we're pretty much at the end of our time, but we want to throw in some examples of some of the complex processing we had to do to show you that you've got to work through these, and there's different ways to come up to the solutions that you need. It's all based on your content and what needs to happen to it, on its way to getting into D8. So here we have multi-steps, and this one is an example of using several different plugins that we talked about, and it's an example of how static map doesn't do exactly what you think it would if you just read it. So what we're doing here is we've got a field in D7 that was optional. It didn't even actually exist for some content types, but it's required in D8. So we've got to do a few steps here to make sure that we end up with a value 100% of the time. We set a pseudo field that is a default value. We get our field organization, which is our source, that sometimes has a value, sometimes doesn't. We add in our fallback value, and here we're using the callback plugin that Jim mentioned a second ago. This allows you to call any PHP function and run it on this current step in your processing. So we call array filter. Array filter looks for empty items in the array and removes them. We call reset to move the array pointer back to the top of the list. And so ideally, this should end up with our primary org variable has an array with something in it. So now we can pass that to the static map plugin where it's going to map into our taxonomies. And if you can notice the line numbers, there's a big jump in there because we have this huge list of taxonomy terms that we have to map. And then at the end of it all, if none of those items map, we want to set a default value. Well, this only works if there is a value in the input. If we would have just called our field organization and it was empty for this node, and then we throw that to static map says, well, null is not in my list. Null doesn't exist, so I can't set anything. So, this is figuring out what these plugins actually do and what they expect from you. Here's one where in our source, we had 3 fields, first name, middle name, last name. Your content editors are not the greatest, most careful editors. Sometimes they copy paste and they've got little spaces on the ends. Sometimes people don't have a middle name entered in the system, and for some reason in our previous site, if you didn't enter a middle name, your middle name was a space. So it was entirely possible for Jim Smith to be brought in as Jim space 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 Smith. Well, we don't want that, right? We're taking the opportunity here to clean up our content. So what we've done here is we concatenate these 3 items and we throw in that caret as a delimiter. So that gives us an item that we can then target through a series of steps to remove. And the goal at the end is we wind up with first name space, middle name space, last name, or first name space, last name, if that's our case. Like we don't end up putting the bad data back in the new site. All right, we've cleaned it up. Here's another nasty one. We're dealing with all these taxonomies. Like Jim said earlier, we had 48 different taxonomy fields that needed to be combined into our target field. So we set up our pseudo variable on the left. Again, notice the jump in the lines there from 148 to 185. We had a lot of terms. Sometimes, these vocabularies, you could choose the parent, but they also have children. So when we do that concatenation of all those things, we end up with an array of arrays, right? So we want to flatten that to create a singular array of items. And again, we're setting a default value, a dummy value, in case those are all empty, because it's possible. And then we've got to do our processing on it. We skip out if we have our dummy value because that tells us there was nothing there. We do the mapping. And then here at the very end, we're using our custom make unique plugin because it is based on the changes of names, and organizations love to change their name all the time. You could end up with, multiple D7 terms mapping to the same D8 term. Well, we don't want to show the same division on the page twice, right? So we got to remove them. So that's where our little make unique plugin comes in. There's the make unique plugin, like we showed. Very simple, but very effective, and helps us do a lot of cleanup work. Another example of knowing your source and fixing problems. In D7, this field blog slide caption field was a long text field. In D8, it was decided that's going to be a short text field. So if you just try to cram it in there, you're going to get errors. So we had to come up with this truncate to 255 plugin to clean it up. The plugin is really straightforward. We just take in that value, we check the length. If the length is less than 256, okay, it's good, fine, send it on. If it's larger than that, we're going to cut off the end of it, throw in an ellipsis on the end so it looks a little bit more obvious at what's happened, and people don't just say, why is my content cut off at the end? Because you didn't listen to the length. Which is a really simple plugin that helps clean things up and make things look nice.
And you might have been able to do the same thing with the contrib and core plugins, but sometimes creating your own custom does exactly what you want without trying to test and test and test. If you understand what you need to do, that's the way to go. So that's the end of the presentation. If you have any questions, I know we're running long, but we're happy to stay here and answer anything you have. Yes?
How did you estimate the level of effort on this before you started? Or did you?
Yeah. Well, we fortunately didn't have to put a number on that, whereas if you were working with a client, you would have to. So I was talking to a friend about migration this morning, and he said that he takes whatever estimate he has and then he triples it. Because to be honest, even when you think you understand what your content is, and I've made this mistake about 30 times in this process where I think, okay, I've already done this one migration and the next one is going to be very similar, so I just need to copy the file and change a few variable names and rerun it, and it'll all be fine. And then it's taken me a week to fix all the things that I didn't realize because I didn't fully understand what that data was from the beginning. And a lot of that is our mistake, where we, as we said before, we made mistakes, and one of those was not planning out as well as we thought we were what we were migrating from and to. And but the bottom line is, it is going to take probably 3 times more than you expect.
How many hours are you guys into this, do you think?
No, I don't want to commit to a time.
We measure this in months.
Okay.
You mentioned you didn't migrate the configuration, so did you manually create the content sites in D8?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There again, we did have a plan, and we ended up having to change some of that plan, but we did have a plan on a spreadsheet, and so it was fairly easy to create all the content types in the new site going on the basis of what the spreadsheet was. And we could have just used that and reconstructed a migration based on that, I suppose, but we didn't choose that approach.
That's not something that we've encountered that I know of.
Yeah. No.
And that I don't know, that seems like a configuration thing on the D8 side that shouldn't be.
Yeah, I think that, well, for one thing, if I were copying a database from one to another, I would clear the cached tables first.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't, I would make sure that that Drupal still had those tables, that they were just truncated.
Was it a full migration? Just like a site-to-site type thing?
Sorry, can't help you on that one, I don't think.
Luckily, that's one thing we haven't
Yeah,
encountered.
yeah. We thought we'd run into everything.
Do as much planning as you think you need. There's always one more thing.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah. That's
Exactly.
rule number
And,
one.
and that goes into, the planning thing that you just said. A big problem for us is that we're still changing. Things weren't set in stone. Especially if you're dealing with a customer, if you can get this agreement signed off on, this is the content, these are the content types, these are the fields. Like, we're not going to come back to you in a month after you've already written all this and say, well, we've decided to, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
If you've got a mock-up, mark it up and know that, where everything's coming from.
I think one of the things we proved is you are your own worst customer.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you very much.